The water came at 3 in the morning, fast and black, filling the lower pasture in less than an hour. By dawn, when the fire department boat motored past Roy Hutchins's half-submerged barn, the cattle on the ridge stood belly-deep in good grass, chewing their cud while their owner slept dry in his house. Below them, his neighbor Martin's herd bawled from a rapidly shrinking island of mud, waiting for rescue that would take until noon to arrive. 6 weeks earlier, Nora Peterson had stood at her fence line, studying the sky with the same attention her grandfather had taught her when she was 8 years old. Not the clouds, anyone could read clouds. The birds, the way they flew, where they roosted, how they called to each other. "They're moving high," she said to no one in particular. Her cattle grazed the bottomland, 50 head of black Angus in the rich pasture along Kettle Creek. Best grass in Harmon County, everyone said. The creek ran gentle most of the year, a lazy ribbon that barely filled its banks. Nora walked back to her truck and pulled out the topographic maps she'd found in her grandfather's papers. The contour lines told a story the current landscape hid. This whole valley had flooded in 1974, then again in '82, before the Army Corps came through with their flood control improvements. They'd straightened the creek, promised everyone the problem was solved forever. Forever had lasted 42 years. She made her decision that afternoon, called Roy Hutchins, her northern neighbor, asked if she could rent his upland pasture through October. "That's rough ground," Roy said. "Rocky, sparse grass. You'd be better off keeping them where they are." "I'll pay full rate." "Nora, I'm trying to help you. That upper field's not worth half what you're grazing now." "Is it available or not?" He paused. "It's available, but I don't understand why you'd move good cattle off good grass to put them on hardscrabble. Doesn't make sense." "I'll bring the check by tomorrow." She spent the next 3 days moving fence, running temporary water lines, setting up mineral stations on the high ground. The cattle protested. They knew quality forage when they tasted it. She moved them anyway, using patience and grain buckets, leading rather than pushing. Martin Schaefer stopped his truck on the county road, watched her work. "You feeling all right, Nora?" she continued, stringing wire. "Fine, thanks. It's just moving your herd up there seems odd. That's awful ground." "It'll do. Your bottom pasture's the best in the county. Everyone knows it." "I'm aware." Martin shook his head. "Your grandfather wouldn't have done this. He knew good land management." "My grandfather's the one who taught me to read weather." "Weather?" Martin laughed. "Nora, the forecast is clear through September. We're in a drought pattern, creeks running 2 feet below normal." She looked at him, then really looked. Saw the certainty in his face, the comfortable conviction of a man who'd farmed 40 years and thought he'd seen everything. "You might want to move your herd up too," she said. "In a drought, that's backwards thinking. Suit yourself." At the feed store that week, Bill Morrison brought it up while weighing her mineral order. "Heard you moved your cattle to Roy's upper section." "That's right. Folks are wondering if maybe you're having some trouble, financial or otherwise. You know we're here to help if I'm not having trouble. It's just unusual. And with you out there alone since your grandpa passed, people worry." Nora paid cash, loaded her truck herself, drove home with her jaw tight and her radio off. The Women's Farm Bureau met Thursday evening at the community center. Sharon Wells, who ran 300 acres with her sons, pulled Nora aside. "Honey, I know you're trying to make your own way, but sometimes being stubborn costs more than it's worth. Moving those cattle made no sense to anyone. Didn't do it for anyone else. Your grandfather would want you to listen to experienced folks." "My grandfather taught me everything I know." "Then you know better than to graze rocks when you've got bottomland." Nora went home early, stood on her porch in the dark. The cattle were quiet on the ridge, dark shapes against the stars. The empty lower pasture looked peaceful, the creek murmuring its usual song. But the birds knew. The coyotes knew. She'd heard them moving den locations, going higher. The deer were bedding on the ridges now, avoiding the bottoms. Nature was preparing, following instincts coded in blood and bone across thousands of years. Humans thought they'd engineered those instincts away. Built their flood controls, straightened their waterways, trusted their forecasts. Forgot that the land had memory deeper than any Corps of Engineers report. September came hot and dry. Martin's cattle grew fat on the creek grass. At the co-op, Dennis Archer made a show of congratulating him. "Smart management, keeping your herd where the good forage is. Not everyone understands efficiency. They looked at Nora when they said it. She bought her supplies and left. The rain started September 27th, light at first. Then the sky opened up. The rain fell for 36 hours straight. Not the scattered showers predicted by the National Weather Service, but a slow, relentless deluge that darkened the world and turned the air itself into water. Nora watched it from her kitchen window, coffee going cold in her hand as the creek began to rise. First it filled its banks, normal enough for a heavy rain. Then it crept into the flood plain, the water dark with upstream soil, carrying branches and debris. The Army Corps' improvements meant the water had nowhere to go but straight down the narrow channel they'd carved, moving faster than the old meandering creek ever had, with nowhere to spread and slow. By the second morning, Kettle Creek was 6 feet above normal and still climbing. Nora's cattle stood on Roy's upper pasture, dry and unconcerned. She'd moved them to the highest section as the rain started, another quarter-mile up the ridge. They had shelter in the tree line, good drainage, and enough grass to last weeks if needed. Martin's herd was in trouble. She saw it at dawn, drove down the county road to where she could see his property. The lower pasture, the same rich bottomland everyone had praised, was disappearing under brown water. His 50 head of cattle clustered on the only high ground left, a small rise near his barn that was shrinking by the hour. Martin's truck was already there, parked at a panicked angle. He was on his phone, pacing, gesturing at the water. Nora pulled over, rolled down her window. "Corps says it'll crest by tonight," Martin shouted over the rain. "But I need to get them out now. Can't get the trailer in roads already underwater on the south end. Call the fire department, they've got boats." "I did. They're evacuating houses first." Said it might be afternoon before they can get here. His face was gray. "Nora, I might lose them. Water's rising a foot an hour." She looked at the shrinking island where his cattle stood, looked at Martin, who'd laughed when she moved her herd, who'd called her stubborn and backwards. The silence stretched between them. "I'm sorry," Martin said finally. "For what I said, you were right. I don't know how you knew, but you were right." Nora put the truck in park, got out. The rain soaked through her jacket in seconds. "Remember the old Hendricks place, 2 ridges over, the abandoned pasture? It's high ground, about 60 acres. Fence is mostly good, I checked it last week." "Last week, he stopped. "You knew this was coming." "I knew something was coming. Get your four-wheeler. We're going to need to move them the back way through the woods. It'll be slow, but it's the only route that's not underwater." Martin stared at her. "You'd help me after I get your four-wheeler, Martin. We're burning daylight." They worked through the rain, Nora on foot and Martin on the ATV, slowly coaxing 50 panicked cattle off their shrinking island and into the woods. The water rose behind them, claiming ground inch by inch. The cattle didn't want to leave, didn't understand why they should abandon the last dry land for the uncertainty of flooded forest. Nora used every trick her grandfather had taught her. Calm voice, steady pressure. Leading from the front, showing them the way was safe. The cattle followed her into water up to their knees, through mud that sucked at their hooves, across terrain they'd never navigated before. It took 4 hours to move them 2 miles. By the time they reached the Hendricks pasture, Nora's boots were ruined and her hands were bleeding from wrestling emergency fence repairs. But the cattle were safe, milling on ground that would stay dry no matter how high the creek rose. Martin stood at the fence line, looking back toward his submerged property. "I'll lose the hay, the equipment shed, probably the barn, probably, but not the herd." "No," he turned to her. "How did you know?" "The forecast said." "Forecasts not everything. My grandfather taught me to watch the animals. They'd been moving high for weeks, birds changing their patterns, coyotes relocating dens. Even the insects were different. You see where the ant hills were built this year. Can't say I noticed. High ground, all of them. Nature knows when something's coming." Martin was quiet for a long moment. "The Corps said this couldn't happen after the improvements." "The Corps straightened the creek, made it faster." When you get rain like this, all that water hits the bottoms at once instead of spreading out over miles of meanders. It's worse than it was before, not better. Jesus. By afternoon, the fire department had evacuated 6 families from the bottoms. Roy Hutchins called Nora, voice tight with relief. "My lower barn's gone. If my cattle had been down there, they're fine, Roy. Good grass up there after all." He laughed, shaky. Best rent I ever collected. Nora, I owe you. You don't owe me anything. Just remember to watch the animals next time. The rain stopped that evening. The creek crested at 8 feet above flood stage, exactly as high as it had risen in 1974 before anyone thought to improve it. The water covered 200 acres of prime bottomland, destroyed 4 barns, and ruined enough stored hay to make the winter difficult for half the county. But not one animal was lost. The water took 5 days to recede. When it did, it left behind a landscape transformed mud-covered pastures, destroyed fences, debris wrapped around every tree and fence post. The rich bottomland looked like a war zone. Nora stood at what used to be her fence line, surveying the damage. The grass was gone, smothered under 6 inches of silt. The automatic waterers were buried. 3 sections of fence had washed away completely. It would take months to recover, thousands of dollars to rebuild. But her cattle were safe on the ridge, still grazing Roy's pasture untouched by the disaster below. A truck pulled up behind her, then another. By the time she turned around, 6 vehicles lined the road: Martin, Roy, Sharon Wells, Dennis Archer, Bill Morrison from the feed store, and others from the bureau. Martin got out first, carrying a thermos. "Thought you might need coffee." "I'm fine." "We want to help," Sharon said, climbing down from her truck. "With the cleanup, the rebuilding." Nora looked at them, the same people who'd laughed, who'd called her stubborn, who'd questioned her judgment. The same people whose cattle she'd helped save, whose property might have been spared if they'd listened. "I can manage." "We know you can," Roy said, "but you shouldn't have to, not alone." Dennis Archer stepped forward, hat in his hands. "I was wrong. What I said at the co-op, the way He stopped, started again. "You knew something we didn't. You trusted your instincts when all of us trusted computers and forecasts and engineers. You were right." "Not just instincts," Nora said quietly. "Knowledge, passed down. My grandfather learned from his grandfather who learned from his. They knew this valley, knew what the land could do when the conditions aligned. That knowledge kept them alive through floods and droughts and everything else." "Teach us," Sharon said. "Please show us what you see." Nora studied them, saw genuine humility, genuine desire to learn, saw people who'd had their certainty shaken, who were finally willing to listen. "All right," she said, "but we start with the cleanup. Learning happens while working." They worked through October, rebuilding Nora's fences higher and stronger, clearing the debris, testing the soil. While they worked, she taught, pointing out the signs she'd read, the patterns she'd recognized, the old knowledge that had saved her herd. "Look at how the trees grow," she said one afternoon, showing them the high water marks on the old oaks. "Nature marks its history, you just have to know how to read it." Martin took notes, actually wrote things down in a small notebook he carried now. "The Corps never mentioned any of this. The Corps looks at data. My grandfather looked at the land itself. Both have value, but you can't ignore what's right in front of you." The county extension agent came by in November, a young woman named Amy Chen who'd only been in the position 6 months. She walked the rebuilt pasture with Nora, asked questions, listened carefully. "Would you be willing to give a presentation?" Amy asked. "At the winter bureau meeting, about traditional observation methods." "I'm not much for presentations. People need to hear this, not just hear other counties. The old knowledge is being lost, and with climate patterns changing, we need every tool we can get." Nora considered. "I'll do a field day, spring. People can come see what I'm talking about, not just hear about it." "That works." The field day happened in April, drew farmers from 7 counties. Nora walked them through her property, showed them the markers, the signs, the patterns, taught them to read the landscape the way her grandfather had taught her. "It's not magic," she said to the group gathered on the ridge. "It's observation, patience, respect for what came before. The animals know things we've forgotten. The land remembers what we've tried to engineer away. You don't have to choose between modern tools and old wisdom. You use both." A young farmer from the next county raised his hand. "How do you convince people to listen? When everyone thinks you're crazy," Nora smiled. "You don't convince them. You do what's right and you let the results speak. Sometimes being right is lonely, but it's better than being wrong with company." That summer, 12 farms in the region moved their cattle to higher ground during the wet season, not because regulations required it, but because the farmers had learned to read the signs themselves. When the rains came in August, not as severe as the previous year, but significant, those herds stayed dry while others scrambled for emergency solutions. Nora's phone rang regularly now. Farmers asking questions, requesting visits, wanting to learn. She took the calls, made the visits, shared what she knew. Not for recognition or profit, but because the knowledge deserved to survive. On a clear evening in September, 1 year after the flood, Nora stood on her ridge and watched her cattle graze. The lower pasture had recovered, was lush again, but she kept the herd high 3 months of the year now, just in case. Just because the land had taught her respect for its power. Martin stopped by, brought fresh tomatoes from his garden. Thought you might like these. Thanks. Bureau's putting together a land management committee. They want you to chair it. I'm not a committee person, Martin. I know, but they're serious about changing how we do things, learning from what happened. They need someone who won't just go along to get along. She took a tomato, bit into it. The taste was summer itself, warm and perfect. I'll think about it. After he left, Nora walked her fence line one more time, checking the tension, looking for weak spots. The cattle followed her progress, curious and calm. The evening birds called from the tree line, settling in for the night. The creek ran quiet and normal below, harmless now, but never to be fully trusted again. Her grandfather used to say the land would teach you everything you needed to know if you paid attention. She'd paid attention. She'd trusted what she learned. And when the water came, she and everyone she'd helped had been ready. Nora headed back to the house as the sun touched the horizon, her calloused hands swinging at her sides, her weathered face turned toward tomorrow. The knowledge continued, the work continued, and the land, patient and powerful and true, continued teaching anyone wise enough to listen.